The dusty road stretched out before the windshield of the pickup truck, a ribbon of pale caliche cutting through the South Texas brush, disappearing into a horizon that shimmered with heat even as the sun began its slow descent. It was the kind of road that held secrets in its cracks, the kind of path that men traveled when they were looking for something they had lost, or perhaps running from something they had found. For George Strait, this road was simply the way home, a path he had driven 1,000 times. Yet, on this particular evening, the dust seemed to rise with a strange, spectral quality, dancing in the golden light like ghosts of the past trying to flag him down. He steered the truck with one hand on the wheel, his eyes squinting slightly against the glare, the familiar landscape of mesquite and prickly pear passing by in a blur of greens and browns. The radio was off. He did not need music today. The rhythm of the tires on the gravel and the hum of the engine were the only songs he could tolerate. He pulled up to the main house, the gravel crunching beneath the heavy tires as he brought the vehicle to a halt. The ranch was quiet. It was a silence that he had paid for with decades of noise, a tranquility purchased with thousands of nights spent in roaring arenas, under blinding spotlights, surrounded by screaming fans who wanted a piece of his soul. He stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud, and took a deep breath of the air. It smelled of dry earth and sage, a scent that grounded him, reminding him that beneath the legend, beneath the title of king, he was just a man who loved the land. He walked into the house, tossing his hat onto the rack by the door, the felt settling with a soft sigh. The house was empty at the moment. Norma was out in the garden, or perhaps checking on the horses in the lower barn. He enjoyed these pockets of solitude, not because he wanted to be away from her, but because they allowed him to decompress, to shed the weight of the public persona that clung to him like a second skin. George made his way to his study, a room lined with dark wood and filled with the memorabilia of a life lived in the public eye. Gold records adorned the walls, gleaming softly in the dim light. Photographs of him shaking hands with presidents, lifting trophies, and smiling alongside fellow legends served as wallpaper to his existence. He sat down in his leather chair, the material creaking familiarly as he settled in. On his desk sat a laptop, a modern intrusion in a room that felt timeless. He opened it, the screen flickering to life, casting a blue glow over his weathered face. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. Sometimes he just liked to see what the world was saying, or perhaps look up old rodeo stats, keeping a connection to the sport that had been his first love. He navigated to YouTube, intending to search for a clip of a recent cutting horse competition. The algorithm, however, had other plans. The sidebar was filled with suggestions, a digital mosaic of his own face staring back at him from various decades. Interviews from the 90s, music videos from the early 2000s, fan compilations of his greatest hits. But one thumbnail caught his eye. It was grainy, the colors washed out, a relic from the era of magnetic tape and bulky camcorders. The title was simple, typed in lowercase letters that suggested a lack of professional polish. Rare footage, George Strait, Houston, 1984, backstage, unseen. It had very few views, likely uploaded by someone who had been digging through an attic and found a forgotten cassette. Curiosity, that subtle and dangerous instinct, pricked at him. 1984. That was a pivotal year. The rocket was taking off then. The arenas were getting bigger, the screams louder, the demands on his time more intense. He clicked the link. The video buffered for a moment, a spinning circle in the center of the screen. before the image resolved into a shaky, handheld shot of a concrete corridor. The audio was a cacophony of distant cheering and the immediate, muffled sounds of equipment being moved. The cameraman was clearly walking with purpose, perhaps a stagehand or a local journalist who had gained access where they shouldn't have. The camera panned wildly, catching glimpses of road cases stenciled with "Strait," passing by men in cowboy hats shouting instructions into walkie-talkies. George leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his chin in his hands. He watched his younger self appear on the screen for a fleeting second. He was standing near the stage entrance, tuning a guitar, his face a mask of intense concentration. He looked so young, so unburdened by the years that would follow, yet already carrying the seriousness that defined his career. The cameraman didn't linger on George, though. He seemed to be pushed aside by a security guard, the camera dipping towards the floor before jerking back up and panning to the left, away from the commotion, towards a darker, quieter corner of the backstage area. And there she was. The camera found her by accident, or perhaps by fate. Norma. She was standing behind a stack of large speakers, hidden from the main flow of traffic. In the grainy footage, she looked like an angel who had lost her way in a mechanical purgatory. She was wearing a blue dress, one that George remembered vividly. He remembered telling her how beautiful she looked in it that night, how the color brought out the sparkle in her eyes. But in this video, there was no sparkle. The camera zoomed in slightly, the autofocus struggling to sharpen the image in the low light. Norma was not looking at the stage. She was not looking at George. She was looking at the ground, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to hold her own body together. Preserve the original language of the text. Cold and sharp. He froze, his hand hovering over the mouse. He had never seen this moment. In his memory of that night, Norma had been right there beside him, smiling, handing him water, telling him to go out there and knock them dead. He remembered her laughter at the after-party. He remembered her dancing with him. But the camera did not lie. It captured the moments between the moments, the truth that existed when no one was supposed to be watching. On the screen, the woman he loved more than life itself was breaking apart. Her shoulders were shaking. It wasn't a shivering from the cold. It was the rhythmic, convulsing heave of a sob she was trying desperately to suppress. She brought a hand up to her face, pressing her fingers against her lips, her eyes squeezed shut. The cameraman, seemingly realizing he was capturing something private, didn't cut away. Instead, he moved a few steps closer, perhaps drawn by the raw emotion of the scene. The audio quality was poor, dominated by the roar of the crowd anticipating the concert, a low, thrumming bass that vibrated through the speakers of George's laptop. But as the cameraman got closer, the microphone picked up the sound of her breathing. It was ragged, shallow. George stopped breathing himself. He stared at the screen, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. Why was she crying? In 1984, they were winning. Everything they had dreamed of was coming true. The bills were paid, the records were selling, the world was opening its arms to them. He had always believed that she enjoyed the ride as much as he did. He had convinced himself that the sacrifices were mutual, that the glory was shared. But the image before him shattered that illusion with the force of a hammer striking glass. Norma lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and glistening with tears. But she wasn't looking at the camera. She didn't know it was there. She was looking at the empty space above the speakers, towards the ceiling of the arena, as if pleading with God. Her lips moved. She was speaking to herself. George scrambled for the volume keys, pressing the button until the soundbar was at its maximum. The ambient noise was deafening, the the screech of a guitar being tested, the shout of a roadie. But then there was a momentary lull in the background noise, a pocket of silence in the chaos. In that second, her voice cut through the decades. It was a whisper, wet with tears, trembling with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight. "Let him go, Norma," she whispered. "He is theirs now." George slammed the spacebar. The video froze. The image of Norma, mid-sob, her face contorted in a mixture of grief and resignation, was suspended in time on his screen. The silence that rushed back into the study was deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. George sat back in his chair, the leather groaning under his sudden movement. He felt as though he had been punched in the gut. The air in the room felt thin, insufficient to fill his lungs. He is theirs now. The words echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his memory. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the window. Outside, the Texas twilight was deepening into purple, the shadows of the oak trees lengthening across the lawn. He looked out at the land he owned, the empire he had built, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt like a thief. He had stolen this life. He had stolen it from her. He turned back to the screen, unable to look away from the frozen image. He had always told the story of their life as a partnership. High school sweethearts, eloping in Mexico, the army years, the struggle in Nashville, the breakthrough. It was a romantic story, a country song come to life. He told everyone that Norma was his rock, his anchor, and she was. But he had never stopped to ask what it cost the rock to hold the ship in place against the storm. He had never asked the anchor if it felt like drowning. He pressed play again. He had to see the rest. He had to know. The video continued. After the whisper, Norma took a deep, shuddering breath. She reached into her small clutch purse and pulled out a tissue. With practiced precision, she dabbed at her eyes, careful not to smudge the mascara. She took a compact mirror and checked her reflection. She forced the corners of her mouth up. It was a terrifying transformation to witness. In the span of 5 seconds, the heartbroken woman vanished, replaced by the supportive wife of the rising star. She smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and turned to walk towards the stage, towards the light, towards him. The camera followed her for a moment before the feed cut to static and then ended. George stared at the black screen, his reflection staring back at him, an old man with gray in his beard and a cowboy hat that suddenly felt too heavy to wear. He felt a wave of nausea. How many times had she done that? How many times had she cried in the shadows, only to put on a smile the moment he walked into the room? How many times had he come off stage, high on the adrenaline of the applause, and hugged her, thinking she was crying tears of joy, when in reality she was crying because she had lost him to the crowd again? He began to pace the room. The study, usually his sanctuary, felt like a courtroom where the evidence was piling up against him. He looked at a photo from the CMAs in 1985. They were on the red carpet. He was beaming, holding an award. She was smiling beside him, her hand on his arm. He walked up to the photo and peered at it closely. He looked at her eyes, really looked at them. He had always seen pride there. Now he saw fear. He saw a woman holding on for dear life as the tornado of fame ripped through their existence. "I didn't know," he said aloud to the empty room. His voice was raspy. "Norma, I swear I didn't know." But the apology fell flat. Ignorance was not a defense, not for a man who prided himself on seeing the truth in songs, on understanding the human heart. He had been blind where it mattered most. He had been so focused on the horizon, on the next gig, the next hit, the next record, that he hadn't looked down to see the ground crumbling beneath her feet. He remembered that night in Houston now with a clarity that hurt. He remembered coming off stage, sweat-soaked and exhilarated. She was there, waiting. He had grabbed her and spun her around. "Did you hear them, Norma? Did you hear that roar?" And she had laughed and said, "I heard them, George. They love you." She hadn't said, "I miss you." She hadn't said, "I'm scared." She hadn't said, "Please don't go back out there." She had given him what he needed, at the expense of what she needed. She had sacrificed her husband to the world so that George Strait could become the king. He sat back down at the desk. He needed to understand more. The whisper he had heard, "He is theirs now," was clear enough, but there had been more. Before she spoke those words, her lips had been moving. She had been having a conversation with herself, a monologue of desperation that the microphone had been too far away to pick up clearly. He rewound the video to the beginning of the clip, to the moment she was leaning against the speakers. He watched her mouth. She was saying something fast, frantic. George was not a lip reader. He was a cowboy, a singer. But he knew people who could see things others missed. He thought about calling someone, maybe a tech guy in Nashville who could enhance the audio. But he dismissed the idea immediately. This was too private. This was a wound in the heart of his marriage. And he wouldn't let a stranger poke at it. He would have to do this himself. He would have to decipher the code of her pain. He opened a new window on his laptop and searched for lip-reading software or video enhancement. He felt foolish, an old man trying to use tools he didn't understand, but desperation drove him. He downloaded a simple video editing program, imported the YouTube clip, and zoomed in on Norma's face. The pixels blurred, turning her features into blocks of color, but he could see the movement of her jaw, the shaping of the vowels. He played the 3-second segment on a loop, over and over. Her mouth opened, her tongue touched her teeth. She looked down, she looked up. Play, rewind, play, rewind. It was agonizing. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing the passengers were people you loved. He grabbed a notepad from the drawer and a pen. He started to write down phonetic shapes. First word starts with an I, or maybe an S. Second word, he, she. He spent an hour just staring at the first sentence. His eyes burned. The sun had gone down completely outside, and the only light in the room came from the screen. He was sweating, the air conditioning unable to cool the heat of his anxiety. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table, his hand trembling slightly. He took a sip, the cool liquid doing nothing to settle the acid in his stomach. He thought about going to find her. She was probably in the living room now, reading a book or watching TV. He could just ask her, "Norma, what did you mean in 1984? But he couldn't do that, not yet. If he asked her, she would lie. She would protect him just like she had done for 40 years. She would smile that gentle smile and say, "Oh, George, that was a lifetime ago. I was just tired. It meant nothing." She would bury it to keep him from hurting. He needed the truth before he confronted her. He needed to know the depth of the hole she had dug for herself so he could figure out how to fill it. He went back to the video. He focused on her eyes this time, trying to read the emotion, to understand the context of the words. There was terror there, pure, unadulterated panic. It wasn't just sadness. It was the look of someone realizing they were standing on a train track and the engine was coming and they couldn't move. Yes, that was it. The first two words were, if he. He wrote it down. If knows? Her mouth formed an O shape, then closed. Knows. If he knows. George felt a lump in his throat. If he knows what? If he knows I'm cheating? No, never. Norma was as faithful as the sunrise. If he knows I'm sick? No, she was healthy back then. If he knows am... He watched the next part. Her face crumpled. She looked like a child. Scared. The word hit him. Scared. If he knows I am... scared. George leaned back, closing his eyes. The sentence hung in the air. If he knows I am scared? He completed the thought in his head before he even deciphered the rest of the video. He knew the man he was back then. He was driven, yes, but he was also deeply attached to her. If he had known she was terrified, if he had known the lifestyle was crushing her, he would have stopped. He would have packed the guitar, turned the bus around, and gone back to Pearsall to raise cattle, and she knew that. She knew that his love for her was the only thing stronger than his love for the music, and because she knew that, she hid her fear. She hid it so he wouldn't have to choose. She hid it so he could have his dream, even if it meant she had to live in a nightmare of loneliness and anxiety. He looked at the notepad. If he knows I am scared. He needed the rest. He needed the verdict. He leaned in again, his eyes straining. The next part was faster. She was giving herself a pep talk. She was steeling her spine. He quits. The word was sharp. Quits. If he knows I am scared, he quits. George let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. It was a confession of ultimate sacrifice. She wasn't just tolerating the fame, she was actively curating a reality where he felt safe to pursue it. She had taken the burden of the decision away from him by removing the variables that would make him stay. She had manipulated the truth out of love. He felt a tear track down his own cheek, getting lost in his beard. He wasn't a man who cried easily. He saved his tears for the songs. But this was a song he had never written, a melody of heartbreak that had been playing in his own house for decades without him hearing a note. He looked at the screen again. There was one more phrase before the whisper. She had wiped her face, taken a breath. Must be strong. Must be strong. The mantra of the cowboy's wife. The unspoken code of the women who stood in the shadows of the spotlight. He thought of all the songs he had sung about strong women, about love that endures. He thought he was singing about fiction or about an ideal. He didn't realize he was singing about the woman waiting in the wings. George closed the laptop lid slowly. The room plunged into semi-darkness. He sat there in the silence, feeling the weight of his career pressing down on him. Every award, every platinum record, every sold-out stadium tour, they were all built on the foundation of her silence. She had carried the weight of his dream so he could fly. He stood up and walked out of the study. The hallway was dimly lit. He walked towards the living room. He could hear the television playing softly. He stopped in the doorway. Norma was sitting on the sofa, a blanket draped over her legs, reading a magazine. Her hair was silver now, beautiful and elegant. She looked up as he entered, and that familiar smile, the one he now knew was a practiced art form, lit up her face. "Hey, cowboy," she said softly. "You been in there a while. Everything okay?" George looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the lines around her eyes, the history etched into her skin. He saw the strength that had held him up when he was too weak to stand, and the courage that had let him go when he needed to run. "Yeah," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just looking at some old stuff. Reminiscing." Norma chuckled. "Don't get too lost in the past, George. We got a lot of living left to do." She went back to her magazine, unaware that the past had just crashed into the present with the force of a freight train. George stood there for a moment longer, watching her. He wanted to run to her, fall to his knees, and beg for forgiveness. He wanted to tell her he knew, but he couldn't. Not yet. He needed to process the magnitude of the debt he owed her, and he needed to find a way to pay it back. He turned and walked back towards the kitchen, his mind racing. The video had ended with her composure, but the story didn't end there. He needed to see the rest of that night. He needed to understand the context. He remembered there was a box of old tapes in the attic, stuff from the early tours that they had never digitized. Maybe, just maybe, there was another angle. Maybe there was more to the story. He wasn't just George Strait the singer anymore. He was a husband on a mission to uncover the true history of his marriage. The video on YouTube was just the first thread. He was going to pull it, no matter how much it unraveled him. He poured a cup of coffee, black and strong. It was going to be a long night. The dusty road outside was dark now, but inside George's heart, a light had been turned on, illuminating a room he had never dared to enter, the room of her sacrifice. And he wasn't leaving until he had seen every corner of it. The coffee in George's mug had gone cold, a black, stagnant pool that reflected the dim light of the kitchen pendant lamp. It was 3 in the morning. The ranch house was wrapped in a silence so profound it felt heavy, like a wool blanket soaked in rain. Norma had gone to bed hours ago, kissing him on the cheek and telling him not to stay up too late. Her touch light and familiar, yet now, to George, it felt like the brush of a ghost. He sat at the kitchen island, the granite cool under his forearms, staring at the grain of the wood on the cabinets opposite him. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Norma in that 1984 backstage corridor burned behind his eyelids. The pixelated tears, the trembling chin, the terrifying resolve in her posture as she rebuilt herself from the wreckage of her own anxiety. He had returned to the study after she went to sleep. He couldn't stay away from the video. It had become an obsession in the span of a few hours. A digital artifact that threatened to rewrite the entire history of his life. He had watched the clip a dozen more times, dissecting it with the scrutiny of a forensic scientist examining a crime scene. The crime, he felt, was his own blindness. The victim was the woman sleeping down the hall. He had taken the notepad with him to the kitchen. On it, the words he had deciphered were written in his blocky handwriting. "If he knows I am scared, he quits. Must be strong." He stared at the paper until the ink seemed to blur. The sentence was a key that unlocked a door he hadn't known existed, and now that it was open, memories were flooding through, demanding to be re-examined under this new, harsh light. George stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room, and walked to the sliding glass door that looked out over the patio. The moon was high, casting a silver sheen over the pastures. He thought back to the early days. He thought about the bus, the endless, grinding miles of asphalt that connected one honky-tonk to another. He remembered how Norma would sit in the front jump seat, watching the road, knitting or reading. He had always thought she loved the travel. He thought she shared his wanderlust, his hunger to see the next town. But now the memory shifted. He remembered looking in the rearview mirror once, somewhere outside of Amarillo in a blizzard, and seeing her staring out at the whiteout conditions. He had asked her what she was thinking. She had smiled, that damn smile, and said, "Just looking for the clearing, George." Now he realized she wasn't looking for a break in the weather. She was looking for an escape. She was terrified. Terrified of the ice, terrified of the speed, terrified that the metal box hurtling through the night contained her entire world, and it was all too fragile. And yet, she never asked him to slow down. She never asked him to stop. She sat in the jump seat, her knuckles white around her knitting needles, and played the part of the fearless co-pilot, because she knew that if she showed fear, the captain would ground the ship, and George Strait didn't belong on the ground. He turned away from the window and walked back to the study. He needed to go deeper. The lip reading was only the surface. He needed to understand the context of that night in Houston. He rummaged through the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet where he kept the old itineraries. The paper was yellowed, brittle to the touch. 1984, Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. It was a massive show, the turning point. He found the date, February. He ran his finger down the schedule. Sound check, 2 p.m. Press, 4 p.m. Meet and greet, 5:30 p.m. Showtime, 8 p.m. It looked like a standard day, but then he remembered something else about that time. That was the month they had been trying to buy the first big piece of land. The financial pressure was immense. He had leveraged everything on the success of the tour. If he failed, they lost the dream of the ranch. He sat back in his chair, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Norma handled the books back then. She knew the numbers better than he did. She knew that they were walking a tightrope over a canyon of debt. While he was worried about hitting the high notes and keeping the crowd entertained, she was worried about whether they would have a roof over their heads if the ticket sales dipped. The pressure on her must have been crushing, and she bore it alone. She didn't tell him how close they were to the edge because she needed him to perform with the confidence of a winner, not the desperation of a man about to lose his home. "You protected me," he whispered to the empty room. "You took all the bullets so I could stand tall." He turned back to the laptop. He opened the video editing software again. He had deciphered the middle part of her monologue, but there was the beginning and the very end, the parts that were mumbled into her hands. He put on a pair of high-quality studio headphones, the kind he used for mixing tracks. He closed his eyes and listened to the audio, ignoring the visual for a moment. He turned the volume up until the static hissed like a snake in his ears. Beneath the roar of the crowd and the clatter of road cases, he heard the rhythm of her breath. Inhale, hitch, exhale, sob. It was the rhythm of a panic attack. He knew that sound. He had heard it from rookie riders behind the chutes before they climbed on to a 2-ton bull. It was the sound of a human being facing their mortality. He isolated a specific frequency range, trying to cut out the bass of the arena noise. Her voice became tinny, robotic, but clearer. "Don't let him see," she whispered. This was before the "if he knows" line. Don't let him see the shaking. George opened his eyes and looked at the screen. He zoomed in on her hands in the video. She was clutching her elbows. Her fingers were digging into her flesh. She was physically holding herself together. Don't let him see the shaking. He felt a wave of nausea. He thought about all the times he had held her hand before a show. He remembered feeling a vibration, a tremor. He had always joked, "Cold hands, warm heart," or assumed she was just chilly in the air-conditioned venues. He had never considered that she was vibrating with terror. He had held her hand and absorbed her strength, never realizing he was draining her battery to charge his own. He moved the playhead to the end of the clip, after she had wiped her tears and checked her reflection. The camera followed her as she walked toward the light. Just before she stepped out of the shadows of the speaker stack, she paused. It was a split-second hesitation, a falter in her step. Her head dipped. He replayed it, frame by frame. Her lips moved one last time. It was a single word, a name. Bubba. George froze. His heart stopped in his chest. Bubba, their son, George Jr. He was just a little boy then. In 1984, he would have been 3 years old, maybe 4. He was back at the hotel with a nanny, or maybe with her parents. He wasn't at the venue. Bubba. She wasn't just crying for herself. She was crying for the mother she couldn't be because she had to be the wife of a star. She was crying because she was missing bedtime.
She was crying because she knew that this life, this monster of fame they were feeding, was going to consume their family's normalcy. She was saying his name like a prayer or an apology. George ripped the headphones off his head and threw them onto the desk. The clatter was loud in the silent house. He stood up and paced the room, his boots heavy on the rug. This was too much. It was an excavation of guilt that kept hitting new layers of bedrock. He walked out of the study and down the hall, drawn by a magnetic force to the bedroom. He pushed the door open gently. The room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the blinds. Norma was asleep on her side, her breathing steady and soft. He walked to the side of the bed and looked down at her. She looked peaceful now. The lines of worry that he had seen in the video were smoothed out by sleep and the passage of time. But George couldn't unsee the young woman in the blue dress. He couldn't unhear the whisper. He knelt down beside the bed, the carpet rough against his knees. He reached out and hovered his hand over hers, which rested on the quilt. He wanted to wake her up. He wanted to shake her and say, "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me do this to you?" But he knew the answer. She did it because she loved him. And in her world, love meant sacrifice. Love meant making yourself small so the other person could be big. It was a generational definition of love, a cowboy's wife definition, born of grit and silence. He pulled his hand back. He couldn't wake her, not with this heavy heart. He needed to understand the full scope of the performance before he could apologize for it. He stood up and backed out of the room, closing the door silently. He went back to the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the sink. He needed something stronger. He poured a glass of whiskey, no ice. He took a sip, the burn welcoming. He sat back down at the island. The video had destroyed the Act 1 of his life's narrative, the idea that they were equal partners in the joy of the journey. Act 2, the transcription, was revealing the mechanics of the deception. But Act 3 was the pain. And the pain wasn't just in the past. It was in the realization that the performance might never have ended. Does she still do it? The question haunted him. Does she still put on the mask before we go to the grocery store? Does she still steal herself before a charity gala? Or has the mask become the face? Has she worn it so long that she doesn't know where Norma ends and Mrs. George Strait begins? He thought about the last few years. He had slowed down, fewer tours, more time at the ranch. He thought he was doing it for himself because he was getting older. But maybe, subconsciously, he had sensed her fatigue. Or maybe, even in his retirement, he was still taking up all the air in the room. He remembered a moment from last week. They were watching a movie, a sad one. Norma had started crying, not just a little tear, but weeping. George had put his arm around her and asked what was wrong. She had said, "It's just the movie, honey. It's so sad." But was it the movie? Or was it the 50 years of held-back tears finding a convenient outlet? Was she using the fiction on the screen to release the reality of her own suppressed emotions? George felt a sudden, desperate need to see her off stage in the present day. He needed to catch her when she didn't know he was looking, just like that cameraman in 1984. But he wasn't a spy. He was her husband. The sun began to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and bleeding orange. The ranch was waking up. He heard the distant lowing of cattle. He hadn't slept a wink. He washed his face with cold water in the kitchen sink, trying to scrub away the exhaustion. Norma walked into the kitchen at 6:30 a.m. sharp, as she always did. She was wearing her robe, her hair brushed, her face fresh. She saw him sitting there, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, the empty whiskey glass in front of him. She stopped. Her eyes scanned him, the slump of his shoulders, the redness in his eyes. For a second, just a fraction of a second, George saw it. The flash of panic, the fear, the "if he knows, he quits" look. She thought something was wrong with him. She thought the stability of their world was threatened. And then the mask slammed into place. "Good morning, George," she said, her voice bright, cheerful, steady. "You're up early, or up late. Did the coyotes keep you awake?" She moved to the coffee pot, starting the ritual, her back to him. George watched her. He saw the tension in her neck. He saw how tightly she gripped the handle of the carafe. She was terrified that he was sick, or sad, or dying. And instead of asking, instead of falling apart, she was making coffee. She was normalizing the room. She was setting the stage for him to be okay. "Norma," George said. His voice was rough, like gravel tumbling in a dryer. She didn't turn around. "Yes, honey. Eggs or oatmeal today?" "I watched a video last night," he said. He didn't want to lead with this, but he couldn't help it. The words fell out of his mouth. Norma paused. The water running into the pot stopped. She stood perfectly still. "A video? Of what? One of the horses?" "No," George said. "Of you. Houston, 1984. Her shoulders stiffened. It was subtle, but to a man who had spent the last 8 hours studying her body language frame by frame, it was as obvious as a scream. She slowly turned around. The smile was there, plastered on, but the eyes were wary. "Oh, Lord," she laughed, a light, airy sound that didn't reach her chest. 1984! Look at us, digging up ancient history. I bet I had that terrible perm, didn't I? And that blue dress? I always hated how that dress fit." She was deflecting. She was rewriting the scene before he could even describe it. She was focusing on the vanity, the superficial details, trying to steer him away from the emotional core. "You were wearing the blue dress," George said, standing up slowly. "You were backstage, behind the speakers." Norma's smile faltered. "Just a millimeter." "Was I? I don't remember. That was 1,000 shows ago, George. Who can remember one night in Houston?" "You were crying," George said. He took a step towards her. "You were crying, Norma, and you were talking to yourself." Norma turned back to the counter, her hands busy with the coffee filter. Her movements were jerky, too fast. "I was probably just tired, George. The boys were small, the travel was hard. You know how it is. Hormones, probably. You said, 'If he knows I am scared, he quits.'" The silence that followed was absolute. The kitchen, usually the heart of the home, felt like a vacuum. Norma stopped moving. Her hands rested on the counter. She didn't turn around. The morning light caught the side of her face, and George saw a single tear track start its journey down her cheek. She didn't deny it. She didn't laugh it off. The direct quote had stripped away her ability to improvise. She was caught in the truth. "You read my lips," she whispered. Her voice was different now. The brightness was gone. It was the voice from the video, the voice of the scared girl in the dark. "I had to," George said, his voice breaking. "I had to know what you were paying for my dream." Norma took a deep breath. She turned around slowly. The mask was gone. For the first time in years, George saw his wife. Not the partner, not the rock, not the fan. He saw the woman who had endured. Her face was open, vulnerable, and etched with a sadness that seemed ancient. "You were flying, George," she said softly. "You were finally flying. I had never seen you so happy. When you were on that stage, you were incandescent. You were doing what God put you on this earth to do." "And you?" George asked. "What were you doing?" "I was holding the kite string," she said simply. "And the wind was blowing so hard, George. It was blowing so hard I thought my hands would bleed. I thought the string would snap and you would float away forever. Or worse, I thought I would pull too hard and crash you into the ground." "You should have told me," George said. Tears were stinging his own eyes now. "I would have come down. I would have landed." "I know," Norma said, and the tragedy of it was in her certainty. "I know you would have. You would have quit. You would have come home and driven a tractor and been a good father and a good husband. And you would have been miserable. A part of you would have died. And eventually, you would have resented me for clipping your wings." George shook his head. "No, never." "You say that," Norma said, walking over to him. She reached up and placed her hands on his face. Her palms were warm. "But I knew that the music wasn't just a job. It was your soul. And I made a choice. I chose your soul over my comfort. I chose your destiny over my peace." "But the cost, Norma," George covered her hands with his own. "The cost was too high." "It was high," she admitted. "There were nights in hotel rooms where I stared at the ceiling and prayed for it to be over. Nights where the screaming of the fans felt like they were screaming at me, telling me I wasn't enough. But then," she looked into his eyes, "then you would come off stage, and you would look at me with that fire in your eyes. And you would say, 'We did it, Norma.' And in that moment, it was enough. Being the fuel for your fire was enough." George pulled her into his arms. He hugged her tightly, burying his face in her neck. He held her not like a king holds a queen, but like a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood. He felt her body shake against his. She was crying now, freely, openly. The dam of 40 years had broken. "I'm so sorry," he wept into her hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't see you. I'm so sorry I let you be lonely in a room full of people." "I wasn't lonely," she sobbed, clutching the back of his shirt. "I was just invisible, and I thought that's what I had to be." They stood there in the kitchen for a long time, the coffee pot hissing and gurgling forgotten in the background. The sun rose higher, flooding the room with unforgiving light. But for the first time, there were no shadows left to hide in. But the revelation wasn't over. George pulled back slightly, looking at her tear-streaked face. He needed to ask the final question, the one that scared him the most. "Do you still do it?" he asked. "Are you doing it right now? Are you pretending to be okay with the life we have?" Norma looked at him, her eyes searching his. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, George felt the ground beneath him tremble. "I don't know how to stop, George," she whispered. "I don't know who I am without the fear of losing you to the world. It's become my heartbeat." This admission was more painful than the video. The video was history. This was the present. The trauma of fame had rewired her nervous system. She was permanently braced for impact. George realized then that an apology wasn't enough. A hug wasn't enough. He couldn't just say, "I'm sorry," and fix 4 decades of conditioning. He had to do something drastic. He had to rewrite the ending of their story. He had to show the world, and more importantly, show her, that the kite string was more important than the kite. "I'm going to fix this," George said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make you visible, Norma. I'm going to make sure everyone knows that the king of country is just a man who was held up by a saint." He let her go and walked back to the study. He sat down at the computer. The video was still paused on the black screen. He looked at the comments section. It was empty. 0 comments. Just a forgotten piece of footage in the vast graveyard of the internet. He cracked his knuckles. He wasn't good with computers, but he knew how to type. He logged into his official YouTube account, the one managed by his PR team, but he had the password on a sticky note somewhere. He found it. He logged in. The little avatar changed from a generic silhouette to his iconic face. He clicked on the comment box under the video. He stared at the blinking cursor. What could he say? How could he summarize a lifetime of gratitude and regret in a text box? He thought about the fans who would see this. He thought about the media storm it might create. He didn't care. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about the image. He cared about the truth. He began to type. I watched this today. I have never seen this before. He stopped. He looked at the door. Norma was still in the kitchen, likely wiping her eyes, composing herself, putting the mask back on because she didn't know how to live without it. He had to break the mask. He had to shatter it publicly so she could never wear it again. He turned back to the screen and continued typing. The words flowed not from his brain, but from the wound in his heart. He wrote about the blue dress. He wrote about the fear. He wrote about the lie that had saved his life. But before he hit post, he realized there was one more thing he needed to do, a gesture that went beyond a comment. He needed to close the loop. He stood up. "Norma," he called out, "don't clean up. Come here. We're going somewhere." Norma appeared in the doorway, puzzled. "Going where? George, you're in your pajamas. It's 7 in the morning." "Get dressed," George said. "Put on something blue. We're going to San Antonio, to the arena." "The arena?" She looked at him like he was crazy. "There's nothing there today, George. It's empty." "Exactly," George said. "It's empty, and it's time we filled it with the truth." The drive to San Antonio was a study in silence, but it was not the empty, hollow silence that had filled the ranch house the night before. This was a heavy, pregnant silence, vibrant with the hum of the engine and the unspoken weight of 40 years of history sitting between them on the center console. George drove the black truck with a steady hand, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was miles away, replaying the grainy footage in his head, overlaying it onto the landscape passing by. Norma sat in the passenger seat, dressed in a simple blue blouse, the closest she could find to the dress from 1984, and jeans. She looked out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't ask again why they were going. She knew her husband. She knew that once George Strait set his mind to a course of action, he was as unstoppable as a river in flood. They reached the city limits just as the morning traffic began to thin. The skyline of San Antonio rose up, a mix of modern glass and historic stone, a city that held the memories of their youth, their struggles and their triumphs. George navigated the familiar highways, bypassing the tourist spots, the Riverwalk, the Alamo. He was heading for the AT&T Center, the massive arena that had hosted the rodeo so many times. It wasn't the exact same building as in 1984. The old Astrodome was gone, and venues changed names and locations. But the spirit was the same. It was the temple of the noise. It was the place where the sacrifice had been made. He pulled up to the loading dock entrance. A security guard, a burly man with a gray mustache who had worked the rodeo circuit for decades, stepped out of the booth. He squinted at the truck, then his eyes widened as the window rolled down. "Mr. Strait?" the guard stammered, touching the brim of his cap. "We weren't expecting you, sir. There's no show today. Place is shut down for maintenance." "I know, Earl," George said, his voice calm and low. "I just need a few minutes, just me and the wife. We need to check the acoustics on something, for the future." It was a lie, but a gentle one. Earl nodded vigorously, pressing the button to raise the gate. "Of course, King. You go right ahead. I'll make sure nobody bothers you. You got the run of the place." George drove the truck into the cavernous concrete tunnel of the loading dock. The air instantly changed. It became cooler, smelling of diesel fumes, damp concrete, and the lingering, stale scent of livestock and popcorn. It was the smell of the business. George parked the truck near the ramp that led to the arena floor. He turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was jarring. "Come on," he said, opening his door. Norma hesitated. She looked at the concrete walls, the shadows stretching between the pylons. This was the backstage world she knew too well, the place where she had spent half her life waiting. "George, I don't want to go in there," she whispered. "It's cold." George walked around the truck and opened her door. He offered her his hand. "I know," he said softly, "but we have to. We have to go back to the scene of the crime." She looked at him, startled by his choice of words. She took his hand. Her grip was trembling. He led her up the ramp, their footsteps echoing loudly in the vast, empty space. They emerged onto the floor of the arena. It was immense.
Without the dirt of the rodeo or the stage setup, the floor was just a vast expanse of gray concrete. The seats rose up around them in steep banks, thousands upon thousands of empty chairs, silent witnesses to a history that had already happened. The lights were dimmed, only the work lights illuminating the space in a hazy, yellow glow. It felt like a cathedral after the prayers had ended, or a battlefield after the bodies had been cleared. George walked her to the center of the floor. He stopped and looked around. He closed his eyes and inhaled. He could almost hear them. The roar, the screaming fans, the "I love you, George" shouts that used to feed his ego while starving her heart. "Stand here," George said gently, positioning her in the middle of the empty space. "George, what are we doing?" Norma asked, her voice small, swallowed by the acoustics of the room. "I feel foolish." "In the video," George said, keeping his voice steady, "you were standing behind the speakers. You were in the dark, and I was out here in the light. I was the center of the universe, and you were the gravity holding me in orbit." He took a few steps back, putting distance between them. "I want to change the blocking, Norma. Today, you are the show. You are the main event." He walked away from her, towards the edge of the arena floor, towards the shadows where the equipment would usually be stacked. He turned to face her. She looked tiny in the middle of that vast space, a speck of blue in a sea of gray. But to him, she was the only thing that mattered. "You said if he knows I am scared, he quits," George called out. His voice boomed, bouncing off the rafters. "And you were right. If I had known, I would have quit. But you didn't give me the chance. You took the fear and you swallowed it. You drank the poison so I could drink the wine." Norma wrapped her arms around herself, exactly as she had done in the video. She was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of release. She was finally being seen. The invisible woman was being illuminated. "I want you to listen to me, Norma," George shouted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "I am releasing you. Do you hear me? I am releasing you from the duty of being strong. You don't have to hold the kite string anymore. The kite is down. The kite is on the ground." He walked back towards her, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic cadence. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had the YouTube video pulled up. The signal was weak in the concrete bunker, but it was there. "I wrote something," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I started it at the house, but I needed to finish it here. I want you to hear it before the world does." Norma looked at the phone in his hand. "George, you don't have to do this publicly. It's our business." "No," George shook his head firmly. "Our business became the world's business the moment I stepped on a stage. You gave your privacy to them. Now
I'm using my platform to give you your dignity back." He tapped the screen, his thumb hovering over the text box. He began to read aloud what he had typed, his voice trembling slightly. "I found this video late last night. It was filmed in Houston, 1984. I have watched it 100 times since then. To the person who uploaded it, you probably thought you were just sharing a rare clip of backstage footage. You didn't know you were handing me a mirror." George looked up at Norma. She was listening, tears streaming down her face, her breath hitching. He looked back at the screen. "In this video, I see my wife, Norma. I see her crying. I see her terrified. And I see her pull herself together, wipe her tears, and put on a smile just seconds before I walked into the room. I used a lip reader to understand what she was saying to herself. She said, 'If he knows I am scared, he quits. Must be strong.' She whispered, 'Let him go, Norma. He is theirs now.'" He paused. The echo of his voice died away, leaving a ringing silence. "For 40 years, I thought I was the one carrying the load. I thought the miles, the shows, the interviews were the hard work. I was wrong. The hard work was standing in the shadows, hiding the fear so that I could shine. My success is not my own. It is a debt I owe to her silence. She let me go to you, the fans, because she loved me enough to let me live my dream, even if it broke her heart every night." George took a deep breath. This was the part he had written in the car, the part that sealed the promise. "But I am here to say that the lease is up. I am not theirs anymore. I am not the world's property. I am yours, Norma. Only yours. To the fans, thank you for the years, but the king is retiring his crown. From now on, if she is scared, I don't just quit. I stay. I hold her hand, and I don't let go until the shaking stops." He pressed post. The little circle spun for a second. Then the comment appeared. "George Strait official," pinned to the top. Norma stared at the phone. She stared at him. "George, you just told the world." "I told the truth," he said. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't care about the notifications that were about to explode. He didn't care about the news cycle. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold. He rubbed them between his own, chafing the skin to bring back the warmth. "Look at me," he commanded gently. She looked up. Her eyes were red, puffy, beautiful. "Are you scared right now?" he asked. Norma took a shuddering breath. She looked around the empty, looming arena. "A little," she admitted. It's a big change. I don't know how to be the one who gets taken care of." "You'll learn," George said. "We'll learn together. We're going to go home. We're going to sit on the porch. And if you want to cry, you cry. If you want to scream, you scream. And I won't go anywhere. I won't go to a sound check. I won't go to a meet and greet. I'll just be there." He pulled her into a hug, holding her tight against his chest. In the middle of the empty arena, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000,000 cheering fans, the only sound was the beating of two hearts finally syncing up to the same rhythm. "Thank you," she whispered into his shirt. "Thank you for coming back for me." "I never should have left," he murmured. They stood there for a long time, until the cold of the arena began to seep into their bones. But it didn't matter. The warmth between them was enough to keep the chill at bay. Finally, George pulled away. He kept hold of her hand. "Let's go get some breakfast. I'm starving, and I think Earl probably wonders what we're doing in here." Norma laughed. It was a genuine laugh this time, a sound that cracked the shell of the past. "Tacos?" she suggested. "Tacos," George agreed, "and coffee." Lots of coffee. They walked back towards the ramp, hand in hand. They walked past the spot where the speakers would have been, past the shadows. As they reached the tunnel, the sunlight from the loading dock poured in, blindingly bright, washing out the gray of the concrete. As they stepped out into the Texas sun, George Strait didn't look back at the arena. He didn't look back at the stage. He looked at his wife. And for the first time in 40 years, the dusty road ahead didn't lead to the next show. It led home. The video on YouTube sat there in the digital ether. The view count began to tick up. The comments began to pour in. People were crying in their offices, in their cars, in their homes. The story of the unseen woman had touched a nerve that the music never could. But George and Norma didn't see it. They were in the truck, driving down the highway, the radio turned off, listening to the only music that mattered anymore, the sound of each other's presence. Stripped of the fear, stripped of the performance, finally and completely real.